Welcome to Foundation Sunday. It's great to be here this morning. We tried to do this a month ago, but the snowstorm kind of interrupted us. So we have a much better day. We have a great program today. But before we start, how about a brief moment of prayer? Most gracious Father, thank you for the blessings of this day, for the blessing of this parish, its clergy, and its staff. As we learn more about our history and the role that the Foundation has in our midst, let us always be mindful of how important our mission is to this community, this nation, and the world beyond. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. My name is Will Eddington. I'm a trustee of the Christ Church Foundation. I want to welcome everybody here today. We have a very exciting program, and I'm going to be the least of your worries. We have both Julie Randle and Ann Shine, both of whom I'm sure you really know. Julie has written a history of Christ Church. Right. She's doing a history of the Episcopal Diocese of Virginia. And I think Christ Church is really important to have its own Doris Kearns Goodwin. She really has done a great job, and her topic today will be Myths and Realities, Washington, Lee, and the Christ Church. Secondly, we'll be hearing from Ann Shine. She's a lifetime member of Christ Church. Not over yet. You're just starting. But she's a former junior warden of the vestry. She's on the vestry now. And for years and years, she has been a trustee of the Christ Church Foundation. And for people like me, she taught us how truly important the foundation is to the mission of this church. So let's not waste any more time, and I'll turn it over to Julie. Thank you.
Thank you, Will, for your very kind introduction. And, well, I think it was God's plan. This would be Foundation Sunday, because we had the date wrong in January. You see, this is Christ Church's birthday weekend. We have, for over 150 years, counted February 27th, 1773, as our founding date, our birthday. It's on our seal. Remember that date. And that was yesterday, our 243rd birthday. So God sent the snow because you got the date wrong. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Now we're, of course, gathered here on behalf of the foundation, the wonderful fiduciary who supports the ministry, and particularly the buildings and grounds of this place. And these buildings and grounds are well known to all of us, of course, and to the city and all the tourists that come here. And we're even in the room of Albert Lane's mural, a gift to this church he painted at the time of the United States bicentennial, 3 years after our bicentennial. But is that image, that building, that is important to our story? Yes. And it is that building and its attributes that ultimately got it on the National Register of Historic Places. And the statement of significance of that on that register reads as follows. This is the only thing I'm going to read to you. Christ Church, Alexandria, designed by James Wren and erected in 1767 to 1773, is probably the finest surviving and least altered example of the type of the small, rectangular, two-story brick church that was utilized in Virginia during the last third of the 18th century. Although Christ Church has been somewhat enhanced by the addition of galleries and a tower in the period of 1785 through 1818, the structure has never been abandoned or had its interior completely stripped, as in the case of other extant examples of this late Georgian type of church. Remember those facts. But, that image is important. And in fact, that image has been marketed for long periods of time. On this table is a collection of images of Christ Church that is part of my personal collection, which I purchased on eBay. And if you come to be bidding against CCA 80, that's me. Christ Church Alexandria 80, the year we started attending here. That's my ID on eBay. So if you see that, you're bidding against me. And you are welcome to look at these items, many of which were sold at the Christ Church gift shop. But first and foremost, Christ Church is a worshiping congregation, and that building is the liturgical space where that happens. And yes, it's this wonderful, wonderful place of colonial architecture. But in addition to all of that, we are blessed with two well-known associations of two very famous Americans, George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army during the War for Independence and first President of the United States, and Robert E. Lee, Commander of the Confederate States Army of Northern Virginia during the Civil War. Both of these men worshiped here through much of their life, and since their respective deaths, their association with Christ Church has continued to influence this church, not so much for what they did here besides pray and maybe sing and worship God, but because of what they did in the wider world. Interesting. Now, unfortunately, those stories of these two favorite sons have acquired legend and embroidery over time, kind of reflecting the wishful thinking of generations of Christ Church people. Some of these stories tell more about Christ Church folks' beliefs, values, and aspirations than necessarily the men they're aspiring on behalf. Hence today's lecture, kind of George and Bob 101. If these men are so important to us, we need to know their story as members of our family, not as national stage, but as members of our family. And like I'll start with George, and I call them George and Bob. That's my prerogative, I guess, but I'm sometimes more formal. I'll start with George Washington because he was the first one here. And yes, like everyone here, George Washington was a member of the congregation. You're just like George. I'm not kidding. But membership of the congregation was something different in the colonial time. The Church of England, which was what we were in those days, was the established and primary legal church of the colony of Virginia. You didn't have a choice as to whether or not you belonged. You belonged by law. And by law, you were to worship here at least once every 2 months or face fines in court. I'm sure the clergy wouldn't mind that now. And you had to pay a tax known as the parish tithe for its support. You may have preferred to go down the street and worship to the Presbyterian meeting house, and you could do that, but you still had to show up here once every 2 months and pay that tax. So a lot of historians have said, well, we look at George Washington's papers, and, he doesn't say God or Jesus Christ. He talks about providence, and he's not very emotive about faith. And they say, he really wasn't a Christian. Well, he talked very much in the terms of his day about faith. The faith as it was seen and expressed in his class, while these historians are looking through the lens of 19th century evangelicalism and going, oh, don't see it. Well, but he continued. Not only did he worship here every 2 months, he worshiped somewhere at least once a month, which was a lot for a man of his time and his social standing. So in many ways, he was more faithful than required. Okay. And then the historians will say, well, his wife, Martha, was very religious and he was just doing it to please her. Well, maybe. But he did this, his practice of worship, at attending public worship, he adhered to it even when she was somewhere else. So George Washington had a faith, and he was fed here for it. Now, his attendance at Christ Church commenced, of course, with the completion of the building in 1773, when he purchased a private pew. The auction of 12 pews on that day was part of the plan for building Christ Church, because originally it was going to be a smaller building, and they felt that was what they could afford through the taxes. And they didn't think those taxpayers would be very happy about an increased tax rate for a bigger building. So to have that bigger building, to live into that image, and the image we see today, the builder was empowered to auction off 12 pews for his own personal financial benefit to cover that cost. So George bought a pew, and you go, well, why? He lived down at Mount Vernon, and Pohick was closer. Well, yes, at the same time he bought a pew there. But he also had a townhouse a block down on Cameron Street. So he had a church close to each of his residences. Okay, so George came to church and participated in the way most of you do today. He sat in the same place. Most of us, even though we don't own a pew, usually sit in about the same place. And, after the colonial period, when the parish tithe was changed to a pew rent, he not so happily paid that pew rent on that pew he had purchased, but he supported the church with his money in that respect and for special fundraising efforts. This is all documented in his personal papers. This is not Christ Church mythology. So here he was. He was like people here. He was like Fran Usher, Paul Currier. He was a typical parishioner. He was not, however, like a John Lawson or a Janet Osborne, who are vestry members, because George Washington did not serve on the vestry of this church. And there are people going, wait a minute, Mrs. Randle, I've heard otherwise. Well, yes, and for generations, Christ Church has said otherwise. If you look at some of these postcards, they have on the caption, Christ Church, where George Washington was a vestryman. Truth in advertising was a problem. What is the real story? Well, it goes like this. In colonial times, I better check my tongue. In colonial times, all of Virginia was divided into geographic parishes. And that is how a parish was defined. It was very much like a county. And you belonged to the parish church in your parish, and you could only serve on the vestry in the parish where you resided, where your primary residence was located. So when Alexandria was established, all of what we know of today is Alexandria, Arlington, Falls Church, Fairfax, and part of Loudoun County were part of Truro Parish, and it had two primary churches, one on Hickory Creek, Pohick, and one on the road to the Falls Church. And eventually there was a Chapel of Ease in Alexandria. Chapel of Ease, what's that? It's kind of like a smaller branch church for the convenience of people who are far removed from the main church, kind of like an ATM. It's where you can go get some things, but for the real shebang, you got to go to the big place. Okay, and we don't even really know where that Chapel of Ease was located. There are lots of traditions, none of which have been documented. So, what happens next? In 1762, George Washington was appointed to the Truro Parish Vestry. This is before February 27, 1773, which we keep proclaiming as our birthday. In 1765, Truro Parish was subdivided. It was divided into two parts, with the line running from southeast to northwest, running south of Mount Vernon. And the northern part, including Mount Vernon, became Fairfax Parish. We are Fairfax Parish. And George Washington was elected to that vestry. Yes, that vestry never met. There are no records of it having met. That election was in March. In May of that year, there was a petition to the House of Burgesses who did this dividing, saying, we got to redivide that parish because 2/3 of the people are in Fairfax Parish and 1/3 are in Truro Parish. And if you're supported by taxes, you all are from Washington, you know what the problem is. So, yes, they redivided the parish. And this time, Mount Vernon was south of the line in Truro Parish. And a new election was held, and George Washington was elected to the Truro Parish Vestry. And there he stayed. It was the only place he could serve. Now, in the early 20th century, a local historian named Mary Powell, who was also a Christ Church parishioner, went and transcribed the vestry minutes from that period, and by hand, and then created a list of the vestry members with their dates of service. And then she included George Washington with no dates. In 1994, I transcribed that volume into WordPerfect, now migrated to Microsoft Word. I can tell you, George Washington's name never appears as a vestryman. Never, 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 never. And if you do a word search, you will find it only appears talking about him buying a pew. So the tradition is very strong, but in fairness, we must defer to Pohick as claiming him as a vestry member. He was one of us. He was one of the congregation, just like everyone in this room. Now, his influence has continued throughout past his death, and I'm going to cut this a little short because I'll never get to Robert E. Lee if I don't. But the most important effect he had on the fabric of this building after his death was in the Civil War. His legacy with this church, his association with this church, is what protected it and kept it from being stripped. Now, some of you are probably raising an eyebrow because you've heard that story that goes something like this. In an act of typical Yankee vandalism, depredation, the U.S. Army desecrated Christ Church, ripped it apart, took the font, broke it, dumped it in a river, creek, ditch, depending on the story. Well, Yankees may have broken the font, but it wasn't the United States Army in 1865, or even before. Throughout the war, they used it as an Army chapel, at least until 63. And then it was turned over to a congregation that would adhere to the country of George Washington, not be traitors unto it, as the original congregation was viewed. And the soldiers came here. You read diaries of soldiers in the United States Army that come to Alexandria. It inevitably talks about them coming here to visit George Washington's church, a very sacred spot. But that broken font, it broke later. In 1897, throughout the 19th century, we kept getting more and more tourists, which the Vestry Minutes refers to as excursionists. And it was the job of the sexton to oversee them. Poor dude, he had other things to do as well. And so he wasn't always in the church. And when he wasn't, there are stories about how these excursionists would do tightrope walking on the tops of the pews, rip apart the prayer books, climb into the pulpit and give pseudo sermons, and one day the font was broken. So they may have been Yankees, but it wasn't the U.S. Army. And of course, George Washington's influence here has continued as presidents of the United States come here to worship in honor of that first president. That tradition began in 1924 with Calvin Coolidge, and since then, every president has come here to worship in honor of George Washington, except Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton. Like George W. Bush at this period of time, in his term, Barack Obama still has time. So, George Washington's legacy has given this church stature. It has protected the property because it was George Washington's church. Important because what he did out there, not because of extraordinary things he did here. And the same is true with Robert E. Lee. The Lee family moved to Alexandria in 1811, and his mother was one devout lady. Ann Carter Lee, her kids went to church. There's no question about that. And there are stories documented about him going to church as a boy, helping with the greening of the church. But the profoundest story is William Meade, who became Bishop of Virginia, but at that point was a new deacon at Christ Church, remembered catechizing Robert Lee and shared that memory with him when Meade was on his deathbed in 1862. And we are in the room named for William Meade. Well, ultimately, Robert Lee marries into Christ Church. He was already part of Christ Church, but that was cemented when he married Mariana Randolph Custis of Arlington House. And the Custises were great Christ Church parishioners. Her father was the adopted son of George Washington. These things continue. And so Robert E. Lee had a faith nurtured from childhood, and he expressed it in his writings in a 19th century terms recognizable to historians looking for those terms. And yes, he was confirmed here on July 17th, 1853, with two of his daughters, Mary, you'll hear about her from Anne, and Anne, different Anne. And they were confirmed by the Right Reverend John Johns, Assistant Bishop of Virginia. And that late in life confirmation of men was very typical of the time. And like George Washington, Robert E. Lee never served on the Christ Church vestry. He was a soldier. He was frequently gone. But perhaps more important, the Christ Church vestry was already populated by Lees. Alexandria was a great stronghold of the Lee family. I often refer to it as a Lee ghetto. But his uncle, Edmund Jennings Lee, was on the vestry for 40 years. Talk about a life sentence. And that was canonical then. And his son Cassius served on the vestry an equal length of time. And many other members of the family served shorter periods of time over the decades. So they were the backbones of Christ Church. They were the leadership. They were the ones who put in the hours and the effort and sweat over the budget and dealt with the buildings. Not Robert. But that's okay. You know, he was like George Washington. Now, the Lees lost their local home in the Civil War and went to live at Washington College, where Robert E. Lee became the president. And he ultimately died there October 12, 1870, apparently after suffering a stroke during or after a vestry meeting. He was on the vestry of Grace Church, Lexington, which was subsequently renamed the Robert E. Lee Memorial Church. But he died October 12, 1870, and the following month, the women of Christ Church went to the vestry and asked if they could raise funds to put in memorial plaques to George Washington and Robert E. Lee. Those were in place in the following year, and they're there today, the icons, so to speak, of our two famous men. Now, many other colonial churches have lots of memorial plaques all over the place. You almost can't see the walls for them. Well, at some point after that, the Christ Church vestry decided, we're not doing any other plaques to people on our walls. George and Bob is perfectly good and sufficient unto the day. They turned down the movement to put a plaque to Jefferson Davis. They turned down an effort to put up a plaque to Robert E. Lee's mother, Ann Carter Lee, saying, you know, this is it, this is what we're doing. So you may be typical parishioners like Robert E. Lee and George Washington, but the one thing you can't do is have a plaque in the church. But they were otherwise like you, living in this church as a typical parishioner, something each and every one of us can and does do. Now, I've given a little short shrift to Robert E. Lee's influence afterwards. That's Ann's job. And I'm going to turn this over to Ann. And afterwards, after she's done, we'll do question and answer, if you have any questions.